This is actually my first time to Vermont. I had heard that it was a lot like Oregon, but on the East Coast, and I actually can see the similarities. There's a lot of good people, a lot of good beer, a lot of good food, nice surroundings, so I'm actually pretty excited to be here. Minus the fact that it, felt like springtime in Oregon and then right back to winter here, but, that's all right. So like Heather said, I'm a research assistant for the Barley Project at Oregon State University, so that's located in the Willamette Valley, so on the west side of Oregon. It's real wet during the winter, real dry during the summertime. So I'm just going to kind of tell you guys a little bit about what we do in terms of barley breeding there. Right here is just kind of a picture of one of our fields from a couple years ago. So I don't always know how familiar people are with barley, so I like to start about 10,000 years ago. It's native to the Middle East. Its ancestral form is it's a winter growth habit. It has an adhering hull, so I'll tell you a little bit more about that later as to what that means. And it really domestication started with the selection to shattering resistance. So if you guys are familiar with what shattering is, it's when the grain just like starts to ripen on the head, it'll just fall off as soon as it's ripe. As you can imagine, that's not very good for harvesting. You wouldn't end up with very good yield because grains harvest it, even variable times within a single head. So I mean, maybe they perhaps just went through and started harvesting ones, which still stayed intact on the head, and then started making selections. So I mean, that's kind of similar to what we do now. We just are a little bit more knowledgeable about it. So we'll make a cross of, say, something that's disease resistant and high yielding with something that has good malt quality, with the hopes of getting a disease resistant barley line with good malt quality. And then what you do is you just will grow that out and you'll start making selections. You'll do this in the field, and it's pretty simple really. You grow things out and you choose the ones that look good. And then once you gain enough seed, then you start to do larger trials. So you'll do yield trials just to really see how these things perform agronomically. And then if they're in the top of the class, then if they're looking like a promising line, then you'll actually start to do product assessment on these things. So if it's for malt, then you'll send it in for malt quality analysis. If it's for food, you'll mill it and bake with it, and so on. Well, one thing they didn't have 10,000 years ago was the option to use molecular markers. So essentially, we can send DNA off and get a sheet back that looks like that. And it looks kind of complicated, but you're able, if you understand what's going on and you know what certain genes you're looking for, you can actually make decisions based on that. You wouldn't even necessarily have to grow it in the field. We don't do a ton of that because the proof is still in the pudding. Even if you did make selections that way, you still want to grow those things in the field and make sure that it's correct and accurate. So I mean, in order to do that, you kind of have to understand some underlying genetics. So we do a lot of genetics work. This is just so on the left, it's an example of what's called a genome-wide association scan, and then on the right, it's a biparental QTL mapping population. But so really all that does is we take genetic information and we take phenotypic information. So you go out and in this case it's low temperature tolerance, and you just combine those things and find a correlation, and then you're able to kind of discover or find what genes might be controlling that trait. So then in the future you can select for that. It's really useful for things like low temperature tolerance because that's a pretty difficult thing to select for. It just depends on the year. Some years you have 0 winter survival, and other years you have 100% winter survival in all your lines. So it's a hard thing to work on. In barley, there's really 4 big differentiators between the types of barley, and one of those is inflorescence type, so just head type. The other one's hull type, and then growth habit and end use. So inflorescence type, there's 2-row versus 6-row. So you guys are probably familiar with that, but so all that really means is you either have 2 rows of kernels per spike or you have 6 rows of kernels per spike. It's a big differentiator, but yet it's only controlled by 1 gene out of the 30,000 that barley has. And then there's hull type. So there are barleys, which have an adhering hull, which are the most common ones, but then there's also the hull-less barleys, which, free thresh, very similarly to wheat. We prefer for the hull-less barleys for food barley because otherwise you have to pearl hulled barley in order for human consumption. That's unless you're a big fan of insoluble fiber. Not a lot of people are. You can also actually use hull-less barley for malting, but because it actually gets a higher malt extract. But in the malting process, the hull on a normal hulled barley actually provides like a natural filtration system, as where you don't have that with the hull-less. So it kind of causes some issues in the brewing process, but there are some ways to get around that with a mash filter, or you could add some other types of hulls like rice hulls or something. But that's an option. The other big differentiator is actually growth habits. So there are 3 different growth habits in barley. These are winter, facultative, and spring. So as you can see, like in this picture, this was taken at our experimental farm outside of Corvallis. The front part of the picture is actually spring planted, while right behind it there is what we fall planted. So I mean, it's kind of interesting because you plant them 5 months apart, but then you will harvest them, more like a month apart from each other. So just taking a look at the different, growth habit and winter hardiness traits and how they vary between these different classes. So you have winter types. So these, are low temperature tolerant generally. They require vernalization, which means that they need a period of low temperature in order to go from a vegetative state to a reproductive state. So in order to flower, they need low temperatures. And sometimes they're, not always, but usually they're short day photoperiod sensitive, meaning that if it's short days, then it actually keeps them in a vegetative state. And then there's facultatives, which are low temperature tolerant. They don't actually require vernalization. So, so these things, don't require that period of low temperatures in order to flower. So you can plant these things pretty much, anytime you plant a fall planted barley to when you plant spring barley. And those, it is good to have short day photoperiod sensitivity because you don't have that vernalization requirement in order to keep it vegetative. And then there's, the spring types, which is most widely grown barley, but generally it's not low temperature tolerant. It does not require vernalization. And it's usually not short day photoperiod sensitive. And that usually doesn't matter anyway because you're already planting it after the days have increased, the day length has. Some areas, though, you can actually plant spring barleys in the fall. So, and then of course, another big differentiator is end use. So, whether it's feed, food, or malt, that's one of the big differences in barley. So some of the general traits that we work on are, we work on agronomics. Obviously, that's a critical thing in plant breeding. Everybody wants, better yields, so we work on that. Height and lodging, which are kind of correlated, and those are just a few things that we work on. We're actually kind of trying to get the height of the barley down a little bit because barley does have a lodging issue a lot of the time. We work a lot on disease resistance. So in the Willamette Valley in Oregon, we generally work on, stripe rust and scald are the 2 biggest diseases that we deal with there. So we'll do a lot of screening there. We also send our stuff up to Western Washington where they do a lot of work up there on leaf rust and mildew. And we're actually also doing some work on stem rust, which isn't a problem here yet, but we're taking a proactive approach on that. Another critical trait that we work on is winter hardiness. Obviously, that would be critical if you wanted to grow fall sun barley here. In the Willamette Valley, it's not terribly important, but in order for fall sun barley to be productive, it needs to get an increase in its winter hardiness. And generally, we actually send our barley over to St. Paul, Minnesota, where they do a really good job of killing barley. So, just kind of looking at some of the end-use dependent traits. So for food, we specifically, we don't really care whether it's 2-row or 6-row. That doesn't make a difference to us. We do specifically breed for whole-less just to take that pearling process out of the equation. and we like to work with whole grains. And we also have been breeding for color. So we have an assortment of colors. We have white, we have brown, we've got blue, we've got black. So we have a pretty wide array. We also work on beta-glucan, which is a soluble dietary fiber. And for food, we work on winter/facultative barleys, so fall sown. For feed and forage, we also don't really care if we work, whether it's 2-row or 6-row. Generally, it's whole, but it doesn't have to be. Specifically for forage, we try to make, we produce hooded barleys. So you can see in that picture there, that's actually hooded barley, and it's just more palatable for animals to eat than, the long awns. And also we work on fall sown for feed and forage. And then for malt, it's fall sown as well, and we specifically work on 2-row barleys, not 6 rows. And they do have an adhering hull, and then of course malt quality is critical for malt barley. And something that we're starting to dive into a little bit is flavor, but I'll talk about that in a bit. So why do we focus on fall sown barley? Well, there's a few reasons. One of them is that it's more productive than spring sown barley. It has an increase of about 20% in yield compared to a spring sown grain. Also, it's a better use of resources. If a lot of areas you can plant in the fall and then you won't have to irrigate it at all, or at least it'll cut down on the number of times that you need to irrigate that grain. Also, it might provide better or different options for farmers. You'll have a crop on there over the winter. Also, maybe you can double crop because the fall sown barley will actually come off there, about a month earlier than the spring sown will. And we, more specifically, actually work on facultative barleys. And so the reason that we do that is because, those are, they're very versatile. So like I said, you can actually plant those things, anytime from when you plant a fall sown till when you plant a spring sown. So it kind of covers your bets a little bit. If, say you have a harsh winter and a lot of your barley dies out, then you can come back in, even with that same barley, and plant over the top of it that same exact variety. We also like it from a breeding stand. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I don't know what facultative means. I apologize.
Oh yeah, sure. So facultative just means that it generally is a low temperature tolerant barley, but it doesn't require vernalization. So it doesn't need that period of low temperature in order to flower like a winter barley would. Exactly. Yeah. So that's the idea. And then we actually like it from a breeding perspective just because then it actually speeds up our breeding process. So, because even if we're doing things in the greenhouse, we still have to vernalize them in a growth chamber for 6 weeks in order to get them to flower, is where they're facultative, you can just plant them and then off they go. Yeah, if anybody else has any other questions as we're going, feel free to ask us. Yeah. So looking a little closer at food barley specifically, it's good for you. So that's one of the reasons we work on it. It's good for heart disease, high cholesterol, obesity. Not good for getting those things, but good for helping them. So it's actually a good source of fiber, soluble and insoluble. It has beta-glucan. Oats also have beta-glucan. In 2006, it got the FDA health claim of being heart healthy. That's not really all that well known. And that's specific to the fact that it has beta-glucan. And generally, we actually focus on the whole grain model. So you can breed for really high levels of beta-glucan, and that can be extracted, and then you can sprinkle it on a Twinkie and have a healthy Twinkie. But that's not really the model we like to go for. So we're working on just having moderate levels of beta-glucan that you could use in like a whole grain diet. So there's just like a barley bread up there on the top right that was made in our cereal quality lab. And down the bottom right is actually a Sampa, if you guys are familiar with that. But we've been working with that company a little bit. And Sampa is just a toasted barley flour. So it's a Tibetan food, and you can just mix water with it and then kind of make it to whatever consistency you like. So it can be sort of like cream of wheat, or you can actually even form it into a more solid sort of food. So some things that we've developed in terms of food barley is we've got a couple lines. We've got Streaker. So this is a naked barley, so you can kind of imagine where that name came from. So, and then to keep up with the times, we are now actually calling it #streaker. So what we did with this was we originally had streaker and we were growing it out, but it kind of had this problem with having some holes in it, which is kind of a common problem with holeless barley. So some farmers were growing this, and so this is kind of where this evolutionary plant breeding comes in, is we went out there with the farmers and we actually picked whatever heads we thought looked good, they picked whatever heads they thought looked good, and so we picked 1,500 barley heads from each of their fields, there's 3 fields, and individually threshed all of these things. So then we were able to, determine that, these heads were fully holeless. So then we actually planted that out and then harvested that this last year. So it should be completely holeless now. And we just had planted that this last fall, so we'll harvest that new #streaker this summer. Yeah. And that's actually a straight up winter. Yeah. So, yeah. And then another barley we actually have coming out is called Buck. So you can imagine where that one came from as well. It's a naked barley as well. So Buck naked. That's going to go through kind of the standard release procedure. Streaker is actually a public release, so it's available to anybody. And Buck is sort of the new and improved sort of streaker. It's just got a little better disease resistance, and it's a little bit more productive. And well, so let's see here. So yeah, they are. Well, Buck right now is still, we're going to release it this year, so it's not available yet, but it will be soon. And then #streaker, let's see here, where, yeah, it will be available this year if you're interested. It'd probably be best to, yeah, well, so we actually don't do a ton of just straight spring work. But that's kind of why we're also, that's kind of why we focus on facultatives too, is because then even though we're working on fall sown barleys, then you could also use them as, as spring barleys is kind of our idea. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and that's just winter hardiness problems like winter kill. Yeah. Yeah, I know, that's, yeah. Need some good snow cover, and then, yeah, but it's yeah, it's kind of dicey for sure. But that's kind of, that's where we're going with the facultatives. So, and then some upcoming varieties actually that we have is, so we've got this trial called the iNude Food Trial. So we have a lot of nice varieties in there, or possible varieties in there. That's actually being grown around the Northwest in the United States, and then we're actually also growing that over in Scotland and Spain just to see how it does in those environments as well, see which lines are the most productive in each area. We actually do have, so these are, Black Butte is kind of a population of a bunch of related lines that we're growing, which are straight up spring barleys, and those are colored, so brown, black barleys that are probably a couple years away from being released. And then we have a bunch of double haploids coming through our pipeline, so I'll explain to you what double haploids are in a little bit. So just a bunch of new barleys coming through our system, which we've done a lot of introgressions, of Himalayan barleys with a lot of different colors and varieties and just like unique attributes. But as you can imagine, it's pretty difficult to deal with those things, bring them from that area and then bring them to the Willamette Valley where it's a way different environment. So disease has been an issue in kind of introgressing some of those traits. So just taking a look at food barley, besides the variety, we've done a lot of work with local farmers and processors. Hunt, Sayer, and Simmons, those are the 3 farmers that we did, that we had streaker, that we did the evolutionary plant breeding streaker. On the right there is Tom Hutton. He also owns Camas Country Mill, so he makes cracked barley and rolled barley and barley flour. So we do a lot of work with them. Barley, food barley isn't very prominent, so we have to do a lot of showcasing to try to get it out there and get people aware of it and get people to eat it. So just a few examples of what we've done with that is actually a couple of years ago, so we hold Barley Day every year, where we invite anybody that wants to come learn about barley. We just show them what we're doing in terms of plant breeding. We show them the fields, the greenhouses, our equipment. And a couple years ago, there was a nutrition class which at Oregon State, which actually each student or group of students produced a barley food for the lunch for that event. So that was pretty exciting. They made lasagnas and salads and soups and all kinds of different things. And it was just kind of surprising the array of things that they came up with. Another way that we showcased it was in the Bethel School District. So we actually got it into a school around Eugene, so south of us just a bit. That's a picture of it over there on the right. I think it was still like half sugar, but you got to start somewhere. So we got that into some barley flour and flakes into the schools, and the kids seemed to really enjoy it. And also we have the Down Under Whole Grain Bakery. So that's actually our Australian cereal chemist there on the right. So he likes to do a lot of baking with barley. He mainly works with wheat, but he really likes to work with us as well. So he has a bakery on campus in the basement of our building, so he does a lot of baking, with pretzels and breads and flatbreads that he has for different events. And we've also done some formal assessments on campus. In the nutrition department, they actually did a taste test between some streaker flakes and just oatmeal. I haven't actually seen the results of that, but I actually participated in it, and what it seemed like to me anyway was that, it does definitely have a little different texture than oatmeal does, it's a little bit more solid, but it does tend to keep you full for a little bit longer, I would say. And then we've done a fair amount of product development. So we've worked with the Food Innovation Center up in Portland, and we've worked with them to try to make, they make popped barley. There's just a granola that they made with it. They make different granola bars. So they're just trying to kind of show different opportunities that there might be for food barley. So kind of moving on a bit, just taking a look at sort of what we do in terms of forage and feed. Like I said, we work on 2- and 6-row forage and feed barleys. Generally they're hulled and then hooded for forage. Right now we have 2 varieties out there that are actually pretty productive varieties. These are both winter varieties. Alba is just a 6-row winter. It's disease resistant to stripe rust, scald. It does get a little bit of leaf rust, and that's a public release. And then there's Verdant, which is our forage barley. That's actually licensed to a guy in Washington at Tri-State Seeds. And he's selling it everywhere from Ohio to Morocco, so it's all over the place, but he's been pretty productive with it. So, what's kind of the difference between malt and malt and feed barley? Like, why is there a differentiator there? And it's really because malt barley, there's a lot of specs you have to hit. So it's really a perfect combination of starches and enzymes that convert and produce what a malt or what a brewer needs, a brewer or distiller. And a feed barley is just straight up a grain. Like for us, we really just for a feed barley we strictly breed for yield. They don't really look at too many other criteria for it at this point, and it's just sold on a yield basis. Obviously protein is important, but for us, like feed barley just kind of comes out of our breeding program for malt if it's a high yielder and then doesn't really make the malt grade. So generally, a rule of thumb is that good malt barley will make a good feed barley, but not vice versa. And also, malt barley obviously commands a premium price over feed barley. You need a feed barley market in order for people to grow malt barley, in case it doesn't make the grade, but it just isn't worth as much for that. But this also isn't always the case that a feed barley doesn't make a good malt barley. In these 2 pictures, this is just up in the Skagit Valley, so western Washington. That's actually Alba that they're growing up there, and Skagit Valley Malting has been doing a lot of work being able to just change their malting process in order to produce a good malt from it. Big maltsters don't have the ability or flexibility in their schedules to do something like that, but craft maltsters can make changes and to the protocol to where they can actually, might be able to produce a good malt from a barley that otherwise wouldn't. So just for, just a basic idea of what malting is for people that aren't terribly familiar with it, it's pretty much just controlled germination. So essentially you're, it goes through the process of being steeped, so you're just raising the moisture of that grain, and then being germinated for a few days, so you're just starting the growth, and then you kill it and dry it out. So what this does is just kind of start the conversion of starches to sugars and the development of enzymes. And then it's given to the brewer, so then they can kind of take it the rest of the way and convert, those starches to sugars, and then provide food for the yeast. And then I've just got the Rhein-Eisengebot down here for people who are familiar with the German purity law, but that was in 1516, and it just said that beer was made with barley, water, and hops, and yeast wasn't there at the time because they didn't know it existed. But the reason that was actually made was because they didn't want breweries to be competing, with bakers for wheat. So they needed to keep the bread prices low. So they made sure that only barley was being used for making beer. So what do we do at OSU in terms of malt barley? Well, we actually used to work on strictly 6 rows. We were funded, and that was Folsom 6 rows. We were funded by the American Malting Barley Association, Anheuser-Busch InBev, and Great Western Malting. For those of you, you're probably familiar with Anheuser-Busch InBev. Great Western Malting is just a big malt company, and AMBA is a group who's really there to kind of ensure that there's an adequate supply of quality barley out there for malting. So they do a lot of lobbying, and they also actually provide funding to research projects around the U.S., all public. And so we're still actually funded by those same people now, but we've made the switch to 2-row. The reason that we actually made that switch was when Anheuser-Busch got bought out by InBev, that's what they actually switched from 6-row to 2-row. And they're a large part of the industry and a large part of our funding, so that's the direction we also went. It was actually really nice to do that change because then we're kind of on the same level as everybody else around the world because that's what everybody else is using. So it kind of opened up a lot of doors for us to even get new germplasm in from Europe and all over the place that we really didn't use before. We do actually have some new funders as well, which are what we've termed the Flavor Sixpack. So this is 6 craft brewers from around the U.S. It's Bell's, Firestone Walker, New Glarus, Russian River, Sierra Nevada, and Summit. And so those guys are actually giving us funding to specifically look at sort of barley's contribution to beer flavor. So to be a malt variety, I mean, it needs to meet some specific criteria. And this is just the spec sheet which AMBA puts out every year. So it has, just a few different columns on there. So it's got 6-row, adjunct 2-row, and then all malt 2-row. So the 6-row and adjunct 2-row are, the big guys, the Miller, Coors, Anheuser-Busch guys. And then the all malt 2-row is, all the craft breweries. That all malt 2-row column just got added like a year ago. So it just kind of shows you the weight that, the craft breweries are pulling these days. The number was, what was it? I was just talking to Andrew about this yesterday, but it's, they produce 10% of the beer but consume 25% of the malt, and it's only going up from there. So that's a good chunk. So just kind of taking a look at, what it takes to develop a malt barley variety. I mean, it pretty much takes damn near forever. So I mean, from grain to glass, so from the time you make a cross to the time it ends up in a beer, it can take a dozen years. So I mean, you make that cross, you grow it out in the field, you're making your selections, so you do that multiple years. You do seed increases, you increase it to where you're growing it in yield trials, you're doing that, at one location, then you do it regionally, and then you can do it, nationally or internationally. And then the normal process that we go through is actually submitting it to AMBA, where They do some pilot scale testing. So they do that for 2 years, and then if it's satisfactory, well, they do it it has to be satisfactory for 2 out of 3 years before it's moved on to the plant scale, where it's really ramped up and put through large malting facilities. And then it has to be rated satisfactory in 3 out of 3 years at that point in order to be on the approved list. There are actually other ways that things can end up on the approved list without going through this process. An example of that would actually be Went Malt, which was a variety out of Europe, and Great Western, who's a a pretty big stakeholder in AMBA, liked it and were using it, and said that so they were kind of a champion of that variety and said that they wanted it, so it got put on the approved list. So there are sometimes ways around it if there's a champion for a certain variety to get it on there without going through that process. So as you can imagine, with how long all this takes, we want to speed this up as much as possible. Diseases are changing all the time. The specs that people want are changing all the time. So the quicker you can do this, the better, because you're dealing with a live plant, so it's just a slow process. So one way of speeding that up is through accelerated generation time. Barley is a self-pollinated crop. It breeds true, meaning it's homozygous. So if you have a field of barley out there and you harvest it and plant it again, essentially it should theoretically be the same year to year. You should be able to go out there and pull ahead, plant it, and have it look just like the rest of them. In order to get it to that point, in order to get a barley to be completely homozygous, you have to self-pollinate it multiple generations. So it takes like 6 generations to do this conventionally. So in the worst case, you would make a cross, plant it, harvest it, plant it, harvest it, plant it, harvest it. You do that once a year, and it would take you 6 years before you had a fixed line. A better case would be if you were advancing it in the greenhouse. So you could do this in the greenhouse. So you could get multiple generations in per year since it's in a controlled environment. Or you could do some shuttle breeding where you move things from the northern hemisphere, harvest it, send it down to the southern hemisphere, then they can harvest it, send it back up, so you can get in 2 generations per year. That's one way to do that. But the best case is double haploids, which is what we actually do at OSU, where in 1 generation you actually make a completely homozygous line. So from then on out, you'll plant that barley and it'll be the same every year. So don't get too bogged down in all this, but just to kind of give you an explanation of what it is so you have somewhat of an understanding, is essentially what we're doing is we're turning pollen into plants. So it all starts with the cross. So you make a cross, and then you take that seed, which is called the F1, and you would plant that, and we plant that in the greenhouse, and you would just take 1 tiller, 1 spike from that plant and bring it up to the lab. And what's actually done is they take the anthers out of that plant, which the anthers are what contain the pollen, and they put it on a petri dish. And they actually just put it through a series of stresses that then cause spontaneous chromosome doubling. So what you have is, in the anther you have a pollen grain, which is a haploid. So it's a single set of all chromosomes. Yes? There are some methods, but barley, that's where barley actually differs, is because it spontaneously doubles, as where with other crops you do have to use some chemicals. But barley, just wants to do it, I guess. It's actually kind of interesting because it's not really known why barley spontaneously doubles, but it does. In other plants you do have to apply chemicals in order to get it to do that. So it's essentially, you have 1 set of chromosomes, and when you put it through and barley's a diploid, so you need 2 sets of each chromosome. So through this process it actually does, and then it spontaneously doubles, producing a diploid, or doubled haploid, and then produces a viable plant like you see on the far right over there. And then it's just kind of transferred to different medias because you have to feed this plant, since it doesn't actually have a seed, where it has all these reserves, then you actually have to feed it through the mediums. And then you essentially just grow it up in slightly bigger, what we call magenta boxes down here on the bottom, and then you just transfer them to soil and put them in the greenhouse, and then from then on out you've got a completely fixed barley variety or line that's good to go. So in our facility, we actually do, so we can actually make about 14 unique barley double haploids from one F1. It ranges anywhere from 2 to 40, so 14 is just an average. It just kind of depends on how responsive it is. And we actually do probably about 5,000 a year. Depending on whether or not it's, requires vernalization or not, it'll take a little bit, it'll take 3 months longer if it does. And then we actually sell these on a contract basis. We do a lot of work with other breeding programs. We work with people in Japan, we work with people in Idaho, all over the place. And we will actually do seed-to-seed production for them for $35 a plant. So they send us F1 seed, and we'll grow up double haploids for them and then send them back seed for $35 a piece. Or we'll actually send them in boxes like on the right there and sell them to them as plantlets for $19 a piece. So if anybody's interested, you can just look on Craigslist. So we do it for other people, but we also do it for ourselves. So we do, we pretty much strictly only do double haploids now. And so what we're able to do is, our goal is to get 6 heads from a plant in the greenhouse. So in that, then we can actually harvest those 6 heads, and we're able to go directly into the field that next year, plant a small plot, and then we can combine harvest that. And from then, we already have a decent amount of seed where we can take that and send it right in for malt quality. We can then move it into larger yield trials, so we can do that very quickly. And then, after we make selections, then, once you have 3 locations, 2 years, you're able to actually release a variety if, if it seems like it's a good one. So really, all it comes down to is that if you take nothing else away from that, but double haploids are fast. So they really help us to be able to be responsive to changes that need to be made. So kind of what's next in terms of what we're looking at in our breeding program for malt. So we're kind of venturing onto a couple different things right now. One of them is flavor. So we've looked at that in a few different ways. And if we actually do get to the point where we can breed for flavor, then double haploids would be very critical in that process because it would help us to be able to produce new lines quickly. Another thing that we're looking at doing, so not necessarily just breeding, but we're actually getting into malting a little bit. So in terms of flavor, we've been asking the question, does barley matter in beer flavor? So, everybody knows that hops matter and water and yeast, but, previously people really hadn't looked at barley very much. So that's kind of where, I mentioned the flavor Sixpack, that's where they were formed. We talked to Sierra Nevada, and he called up a few of his friends, and, people pitched in a little bit of money and, gave us, some funding to actually start to do this. So kind of the phase 1 of all this stuff, where this all started, was we happened to have over 1,000 diverse barleys growing out in a field one year. We were actually doing a stripe rust screening trial, but it just seemed like there had to have been another use for having all these things out there besides just screening them for stripe rust. So that's kind of where flavor kind of all started. We harvested probably around 400 of these things. And then we actually sent off 114 of them to get malted up at RAR. And then they were sent to Sierra Nevada, where they've been working on wort sensory and doing analytics on those things to see what compounds are in there, which may be driving the differences. They're still working on that. And then after that, it's actually going to be sent to New Glarus, where Dan Carey can actually brew 1 bottle of beer at a time. I've not seen the system, but it's pretty impressive that he's able to do that. So yeah, because he's more interested in actually looking at the flavor of the beer as opposed to just tasting the wort. So that's going to be sent to him soon, where he's going to take a look at that. And just to note, Full Pint, which is one of our varieties, was included as a check in this study. So I'll come back to that. And then this study is kind of it kind of is always changing a little bit. So then it kind of moved on to 3 varieties grown in 3 locations. We just happened to have these 3 varieties grown in Corvallis, Saskatoon, and St. Paul. So we were just kind of curious of the effect on on the flavor from depending on where it was grown, and perhaps between varieties. So again, these were malted at raw, then sent to Sierra Nevada, where they've been performing wort sensory, and then also go to Dan Carey at NuDuration, where he's working on making beers and actually tasting those. And some of the results from that I've seen is, so they actually did find a variation between environment, which really isn't terribly surprising. It's terroir of barley, I guess, but it's management has a huge impact on the way barley performs, so that wasn't a surprising result. So it's kind of transformed again, and another way that we're looking at this is we were looking again at just 3 varieties, but this time we swapped out Metcalf with Copeland. These 3 were grown outside of Lebanon, Oregon, so still in the Willamette Valley. And we actually sent these things up to the Canadian Malting Barley Technical Center up in Winnipeg. And so they made malts of about 100 pounds apiece of each of these varieties, and then sent them down to NuDuration as well as Sierra Nevada, where both those breweries made beers out of each of these varieties. And they both did tastings of their own. There was also a tasting done down at the Barley Improvement Conference this year. I haven't seen the results of that yet. But really from what we discovered between those two breweries was that each of them found a difference between variety, but their opinion differed. So NuDuration liked Full Pint and Sierra Nevada liked Cloggis. So I don't really know what that tells you, but people just have different preferences. But so it's which one's better. It's hard to say. So kind of where things are moving a little bit now is we actually have all these different crosses with our variety Full Pint. So Full Pint's been a little promiscuous. We've got the Oregon Promise population, what we're calling the Oregon Fest, and the Oregon Otter. So the Oregon Promise is Full Pint by Golden Promise. Some people are probably familiar with Golden Promise, which is a Old English variety. It's mainly used for distilling, but also for brewing. And then Oregon Fest, which is actually Full Pint by Violetta, which is a real nice European 2-row winter type. And then the Oregon Otter, which is Full Pint by Maris Otter, which is another English variety that it's really well known for its brewing characteristics. So right now we're actually more closely looking at the Oregon Promise population. So essentially there's just a bunch of progeny from that cross that we've grown out in the fields. We've looked at disease resistance of these blinds, and now we're also looking at we're getting them malted, and then Dan Carey again at NuDuration is going to go through and taste these and see if he can find differences. The hope would be at some point, probably not anytime real soon, but it would be to possibly be able to genetically map like where these flavor differences might be coming from. So what is Full Pint that I've actually been mentioning quite a few times? But it's actually a 2-row spring semi-dwarf variety. So that's kind of where it got its name actually, because it was a semi-dwarf, so it's pretty short. So people might want to call it half pint, but nobody wants to drink a half pint, so Full Pint was the name. It was actually in the Amber program about 10 years ago, but then it was never advanced, so it just dropped out of the system. We kept it around because it had high levels of disease resistance. So, we actually released it as a genetic stock. It's now a public variety, so it's available to whoever might want to grow it. So it has kind of an interesting story though as to why it has a revival now. So it was used as a check in that study. So Tom Nielsen at Sierra Nevada, said that when he went through, he had no idea what it was. And he tasted it, and he said it tasted like salted popcorn. I don't know if you've ever gotten that from a beer, but I guess it was there. It also had a sweet, positive, clean sweetness. So he was a fan. If Sierra Nevada says that they like something, then other people will probably follow along on that. It just so happened at the same time that a farmer outside of Corvallis, actually in Brownsville, Oregon, wanted to grow some malting barley, so he happened to be growing it at the same time. So he had this production, he didn't even know what to do with it. Then Tom Nielsen from Sierra Nevada came along and said it tasted good. So Scott Sayer went ahead and sent it down to Colorado Malting, where they malted it, and then it got shipped to Tim Matthews at Oscar Blues, and he was a huge fan of it as well. So, so the word just kind of started to spread, and people started wanting to grow full pint. So this last year, Bree Small actually had some production of it in Wyoming. I'm not sure if they're growing it again this year, but the previous maltster there, he's no longer there, but he was really happy with the way that it was malting for him and the way that it tasted in the wort. Seth Klon, who's actually a craft maltster in Central Oregon, grew it this last year, and he's under completely different conditions, obviously, than here. He's got it's irrigated, real low disease pressure, and he got 160 bushels to the acre, which is crazy, at 10.5% protein, which is perfect for him in craft malting. So what we've kind of used it for in our program is we've used it as a parent. So we've crossed a lot of things with it, and if it turns out to have flavor, that's fantastic. If it doesn't, then we at least got disease resistance, and as well as a good stature. It's actually included in, Andrew Stanley was of Valley Malt was working with North Dakota State, so it's going to be included this year in an Eastern Regional Malting Barley Nursery. I guess it's been grown here this last year, and it does sometimes have some issues with pre-harvest sprouting, so if there's late rains or something and it's ripe, that can be potentially an issue here. I'll try to get through these last few slides pretty quick because I don't have a lot of time, but so we're really interested now, in this flavor. How can we better assess this? So one way of doing this is we need a way to be able to malt our own barley. So that's kind of where we're moving now, is to start up the OSU Malt Lab. We've got some funding to do this. So this is a picture of the mini malter here. So the premise was that there was a malt bottleneck. For a long time, you could get 200 grams malted, or you could get hundreds of thousands of pounds malted, at a large malting house, a large malt house. But there was no in between. Now there's craft maltsters, which give you a little, a different level. But we're looking at even a smaller level, so in the hundreds of pounds. And OSU has a pilot brewery, and we had no way. We had barley. We even have a hops breeder too, but we had no way to get our barley into the pilot brewing system there. So if we were able to malt our own, we could get into that system. We could also send it to other breweries around the nation that have nano brewing systems, so that they could test out new varieties, see if they like them, see how they perform, or send them varieties, the same variety from multiple locations, and see if there's flavor differences in these things. So it all kind of came about as a collaboration between us, Fermentation Science, and the School of Mechanical, Industrial, and Manufacturing Engineering, which is also known as the School of Mimes. So we had a graduate student, a mechanical engineering graduate student, actually kind of headed up that project. We gave them, we wanted to produce 100 to 300 pounds of malt, and they designed it and built it. And it was working, so this is actually a couple of years ago, and it was functioning for us, but just not to the level that we wanted it to. It still needed some things to be changed. We didn't have good enough control of temperature on it. It was also in the pilot plant, so it was noisy. They teach classes in there. And during the summer, it is like 100 degrees in there, so we had no way to control the malting. And so what we've been working on is actually getting a dedicated space for it. So this is the fine facility that we'll be moving into. It's actually at the end of one of our greenhouses, and it's actually been gutted out now. And the plan is to just kind of renovate this space, and we're going to move the mini malter in there, and we're also going to get some malt analysis equipment, so we can actually start doing a little bit of our own malt analysis. And then the hope is to be in production probably by this time next year. So I think with that, this is actually the barley breeder here giving a thumbs up to a very nice looking two-row a couple years ago. But for all of your barley needs, you can check out barleyworld.org, and of course like us on Facebook.